Cassius and the survivors of the 17th Legion. The silence was the first betrayal. For 3 days, the forest had rung with the clang of steel, the splintering of shields, and the death screams of the 17th Legion. Now, there was only the soft hiss of rain on leather and the mournful cry of a crow. Cassius pushed the body of his friend, Decimus, off his chest and gasped, mud and blood filling his senses. He was alive. Alone. He rose to his feet, a ghost on a battlefield of ghosts. Around him lay the whole of his world, broken and butchered under the oppressive canopy of the Germanian wilderness. The Legion's eagle, their soul, was gone. He'd seen them take it, a flash of gold borne away by screaming, fur-clad warriors. His trail began there, not as a soldier marching in formation, but as a wraith fleeing a massacre. His only guide was the moss that grew thickest on the north side of the ancient oaks, a trick a Celtic auxiliary had taught him. He had to go west, back toward the promise of the Rhine. Every snapped twig sounded like a pursuing scout. Every shadow held the form of a barbarian axe. Hunger became a dull ache that sat beside the sharper pain in his ribs and the cavernous grief in his heart. He drank from streams, his own haunted reflections staring back. He ate grubs and sour berries that twisted his gut. After a week that felt like a lifetime, he stumbled from the tree line and fell to his knees. Below him, impossibly, was a Roman patrol road, 2 muddy tracks cutting through the endless green. It was a scar of civilization in a land that had consumed his brothers. He was not saved yet, but for the first time since the slaughter, his trail had a destination. He was no longer just running from death. He was walking toward life. He took a ragged breath and began his slow, painful march down the path. A solitary legionary carrying the weight of 6,000 dead men on his shoulders. The road was a cruel comfort. While it offered a clear path west, it also made him feel naked and exposed. The forest had been a suffocating maze, but it was also a place to hide. Here, on the rutted track, he was a single dark shape against the gray landscape, an easy target. He walked near the edge of the trees, his hand never far from the hilt of his gladius, the only companion he had left. He had been walking for hours when he saw them, fresh tracks in the mud, larger than his own hobnailed sandals, and the droppings of unshod horses. He wasn't alone. Cassius melted back into the shadows of the forest, his heart hammering against his ribs. He moved parallel to the road, a phantom in the undergrowth, until he heard voices, guttural, triumphant. Peering through a thicket of ferns, he saw them. 3 Germanic tribesmen on horseback, their blonde braids matted with sweat. Lashed to one of the saddles was a legionary's helmet, its horsehair crest dragging in the dirt. One of the men wore a Roman officer's cloak, its crimson color a blasphemy against the green wilderness. They laughed, passing a captured waterskin between them, oblivious to the survivor watching them with a cold, hollow fire in his eyes. For a burning moment, Cassius wanted to charge, to avenge the desecrated honor of his legion. But he was one man, wounded and weak. Vengeance was a luxury. Survival was an imperative. He remained motionless until their laughter faded into the distance, leaving him once more in profound silence. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, casting long shadows from the trees, he saw a faint, flickering light ahead, just off the road. A campfire. Hope and fear warred within him. It could be Roman loggers, a patrol, salvation. Or it could be another group of warriors, celebrating their victory around a fire. The road had led him here to a choice. He left the road, circling wide into the woods. The firelight cast dancing monsters from the trees, and every rustle of leaves was a sentry's challenge. He moved with the slow, deliberate patience of a hunter, his senses stretched taut. The smell of roasting meat, a rabbit by the scent, made his empty stomach clench with a painful spasm. He crept closer, his body low to the damp earth, until he could peer through the roots of an upturned tree. 4 men. They huddled around the small fire, their faces gaunt and smeared with grime. But it was their armor that made Cassius's heart stop. They wore the segmented plates and carried the short swords of Roman legionaries. One man, his arm in a crude sling, stared blankly into the flames. Another nervously sharpened the edge of his gladius. They were like him, flotsam from the wreck of a legion. Cassius remained hidden, watching them for long minutes. They were tense, starting at every sound from the darkness beyond their little bubble of light. They were not a threat. They were terrified. From the shadows, he spoke, his voice a dry rasp he barely recognized. Aquila. The eagle. A single word. A test. The men instantly froze, swords hissing from sheaths. They scrambled to their feet, staring wildly into the darkness that surrounded them. "Who's there?" one of them challenged, his voice cracking. Cassius rose slowly from his hiding place, his hands held open and away from his sword. "Cassius," he said, stepping into the edge of the firelight. 17th Legion, 4th Cohort. The tension in the small camp didn't break. It shattered, replaced by stunned disbelief. The man with the sling let out a choked sob. He was no longer the sole survivor, a lone ghost haunted by his legion. He was a soldier who had found his brothers. He stumbled forward, and one of the men caught him, pulling him toward the warmth of the fire. He was no longer alone on the trail. Morning arrived with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The 5 men sat around the graying embers of the fire, the brief comfort of the night replaced by the stark reality of their predicament. The man who had welcomed Cassius was an Optio named Gaius, his face a mask of grim resolve. He was their leader by default, the highest-ranking man left alive. "Your cohort?" Gaius asked Cassius, his voice low. "The 4th," Cassius replied. "All gone." Gaius nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I had the 2nd. We were flanked at the marsh. Broke formation." He didn't need to say more. Each man understood the shame and horror in those words. They were survivors of a military catastrophe, and the weight of their dead comrades was a physical burden. For a moment, despair hung heavy in the air, a fog as thick as the morning mist. It would be easy to give up, to let the forest claim them as it had claimed their brothers. But then Gaius straightened his shoulders. "We are not merely survivors," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "We are witnesses. Our duty is no longer to the 17th Legion, but to its memory. We will carry the story of its end back to the Rhine. We will carry the names of the fallen. They will not be forgotten in this cursed forest." A change moved through the small group. They were no longer just 5 men fleeing for their lives. Gaius had given their trail a purpose beyond survival. It was now a pilgrimage, a sacred duty. They were the Legion's final message, its living testament. They stamped out the last of the embers and gathered their pitifully few supplies. Gaius took a bearing from the pale morning sun. "West," he commanded. They formed a small, tight knot, moving with a new resolve. Their steps were still heavy with grief, but now they marched for the dead as much as for themselves. For 2 days they followed the sun, their path a brutal march through tangled undergrowth and sucking marshland. Their unity held. They shared the last of the rabbit, pooled their stale water, and took turns standing watch while the others collapsed into exhausted sleep. The trail, however, had a cruel surprise in store. On the third morning, the forest opened abruptly onto the bank of a churning river. It wasn't wide, but the current was a brown, muscular torrent, swollen with rain from the highlands. There was no bridge, no ford, only the roar of impassable water. The sight broke their momentum. Marcus, the youngest, slid to the ground, his face pale. "The gods have abandoned us," he whispered, staring at the roiling water. "There's no way across." Despair, the enemy they had fought so hard to keep at bay, crept back into their small camp. But Gaius would not allow it. He walked to the river's edge, studying the opposite bank. "Roman soldiers do not wait for paths to appear," he declared, his voice cutting through the river's noise. "We build them." His eyes fell on a tall, half-dead pine leaning precariously over the water. It was their only chance. The work was grueling. Using their gladi as makeshift axes, Cassius and Titus hacked at the base of the tree. The short swords were ill-suited for the task, and each thudding impact sent jarring vibrations up their arms. Quintus stood guard, his eyes scanning the forest, while Marcus, his sling notwithstanding, cleared away fallen branches. For hours they toiled, their movements a rhythm of sweat and determination. Finally, with a great tearing groan, the pine shuddered and fell, crashing across the river to form a crude, slippery bridge. They had conquered the obstacle not as frightened individuals, but as a single, functioning unit. They were still the Legion. The river crossing had cost them dearly. What little food they had was gone, and a gnawing hunger had settled deep in their bellies, colder and more frightening than the Germanian nights. Their newfound purpose was a fire in their hearts, but a fire needs fuel. "We hunt or we die," Gaius stated, his voice flat with grim reality. "Cassius, Titus, you are the most able. Find something. Anything." The two legionaries moved into the silent woods, their gladi drawn. But they were soldiers, trained for the straight lines of battle, not the subtle art of the hunt. The forest was an alien world. They were loud, clumsy intruders. A deer they startled flashed through the trees and was gone before they could even think to give chase. Desperation began to set in. It was Titus who saw it first. Not an animal, but a thin plume of smoke rising through the canopy, barely a whisper against the gray sky. They crept forward, every lesson of caution they had learned screaming at them. Peering through a thicket of gorse, they saw them. Two Germanic hunters, their faces painted with ochre, skillfully butchering a large boar they had just brought down. The sight of the meat was dizzying. It was salvation. It was food for a week, strength for the march, life itself. But it was guarded. These were not soldiers weary from battle. They were lean, confident woodsmen armed with long knives and sharp spears. To attack them would be a wild gamble, a fight they were in no condition to win. Silently, Cassius and Titus withdrew. The image of the slain boar burned into their minds. They returned to the others not with food, but with a terrible choice. Cassius explained the situation to Gaius, his words spare and grim. The 5 starving Romans looked at each other. The trail had led them here to a moment of brutal truth. Survival was within their grasp, but they would have to take it. They huddled together as Gaius listened to Cassius's report, the Optio's face like stone. Marcus looked horrified. "We can't just ambush them. They aren't soldiers." "They are men of the tribes that destroyed our legion," Gaius countered, his voice cold and hard. "And they have food. In this war, that makes them the enemy. We will not be brigands. We will be soldiers. We will set an ambush, legionary style." His plan was simple, brutal, and relied on their disciplined training. As twilight bled through the trees, they moved into position. Marcus, his face pale with fear and reluctance, was sent to the far side of the hunters' camp. His task was to create a diversion. The other 4, with Cassius and Gaius at the lead, crept toward the flickering fire, their bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. A sharp crack echoed from the woods. Marcus had snapped a large branch. The 2 hunters immediately sprang to their feet, peering into the darkness, spears raised in the direction of the sound. It was the only opening they would get. With the silent, synchronized motion of a practice drill, Gaius and his men rushed the camp from the opposite side. It was not a battle. It was a grim execution. Before the hunters could turn from the false threat, the Romans were upon them. The clash was short, sharp, and brutally efficient. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the hunters' fire. The 5 Romans stood over the bodies, their chests heaving. Before them lay the boar, a feast that would keep them alive. But there was no triumph in their eyes, only the hollow look of men who had just traded a piece of their honor. It was Marcus who broke first. After a few mouthfuls, he turned away and retched, his body rejecting the meal. He looked at Gaius, his eyes shining with tears of anger and shame. "That was murder," he choked out. "We are no better than the barbarians who did this to us." Gaius didn't flinch. He slowly chewed his piece of meat before answering, his voice dangerously quiet. "What we did was survive. The legion is gone, Marcus. The rules of the Forum do not apply in this forest. Our mission is to reach the Rhine. I would kill 100 of them if it meant one of us made it back with the story. That is what a Roman does. He wins." Titus and Quintus said nothing, their faces grim masks as they continued to eat. They were soldiers. They understood the brutal math of survival. But Cassius felt caught in the chasm between the two. He saw the horror in Marcus's eyes and felt its echo in his own soul. Yet he also understood the iron logic in Gaius's words. His own hands were stained, his own stomach full of the spoils of their grim work. The fire crackled between them, no longer a symbol of unity, but a barrier separating them. They had a full belly for the first time in over a week, but their fellowship was starving. The silence of their march was heavier than it had been during their starvation. Marcus walked slightly apart from the others, a visible rift in their formation. Gaius pushed them onward with a relentless pace, his face set like flint. He had been proven right. They were stronger now, but the cost was a fragile, resentful peace. Late one afternoon, they came upon a sight that brought them all to a halt. A small clearing in the forest, containing a single hut with a turf roof. A thin tendril of smoke curled from a hole in the roof, and in a crude pen beside it, a solitary goat chewed patiently. It was a farmstead, a family home. Gaius saw supplies. "We watch until nightfall," he ordered in a low voice. "We take the goat and any grain we can find. No witnesses." "No," Marcus said immediately, his voice shaking but firm. He stepped in front of Gaius, blocking his path. "They are farmers. There could be children in there. I will not be part of this. The 17th did not die, so we could become monsters who prey on families. I am your commanding officer, and this is a supply raid," Gaius hissed, his hand dropping to the hilt of his sword. "And we will not obey that order," a new voice said. It was Cassius. He moved to stand with Marcus. He looked at Gaius, not with the fire of youthful rebellion, but with the weary certainty of a man who had found a line he would not cross. The hunters were one thing. This is another. Gaius's eyes darted to Titus and Quintus. They stared back at him, their expressions unreadable. But they made no move to support him. He was alone. His authority, forged in logic and survival, had shattered against the shield of his men's conscience. He stared at them for a long, venomous moment, his authority broken. "Fine," he spat, turning away from the farmstead. "Walk, then. Let's see how far your honor carries you when you're starving again." He stalked back into the forest without a backward glance. The others followed, leaving the farm and its promise of life untouched. They were still a unit, but they were now led by a man whose command they had rejected. Gaius's bitter prophecy began to come true. The last of the boar meat was a fading memory, and the gnawing hunger returned with a vengeance. Their moral victory at the farmstead felt hollow now, a foolish luxury in a world that only respected strength. Gaius led them on without a word, his rigid back a constant, silent accusation. The breaking point came 3 days later. It was Marcus who fell, his legs buckling under him. He was too weak from hunger and despair to rise again. He lay on the forest floor, a testament to their failed honor. The group halted, the standoff between them finally reaching its crisis. Cassius approached Gaius, his own stomach aching with emptiness. "You were right, Optio," Cassius said, his voice quiet. "Honor makes for a poor meal, but we are still his brothers, and we do not leave a Roman to die. Tell us what to do." He wasn't challenging Gaius's authority. He was submitting to it, asking for leadership. For the first time in days, Gaius turned and truly looked at his men. At Marcus, fading on the ground. At Cassius, offering an olive branch. At the others, their faces etched with fear. The iron mask of his anger finally cracked. He knelt, uncorking his own nearly empty water skin, and lifted Marcus's head, giving him the last few drops. "Titus, Quintus, forage. Find roots, berries, anything," he commanded, his voice once again that of a leader. "Cassius, with me. We hunt." As if the gods themselves had been watching, waiting for this moment of reconciliation, salvation appeared. As Cassius and Gaius pushed through a dense thicket, they didn't find an animal. They found a path, a trampled, muddy track that was clearly a local trade route, and just around a bend lay an overturned cart, one wheel broken. Its owner was long gone, but a single burlap sack had split open, spilling a small hoard of dried grain onto the ground. It was not a feast. It was not a miracle. It was simply enough. They had been tested, and the trail had provided. The grain, ground between stones and boiled into a gritty porridge, became their daily ritual. It was a sacrament that bound them together. The march resumed, but the dynamic had changed. Gaius led not with cold fury, but with a quiet, focused determination. The others followed, their trust in him restored, tempered by the knowledge that their own voices mattered. They were a unit again, scarred and battered, but whole. The trade path they followed began to show signs of Roman influence. They saw trees felled with the clean, powerful cuts of a legionary axe, and, one afternoon, the remnants of a military-style corduroy road crossing a bog. Each sign was a milestone, pulling them forward, whispering that home was near. After another week of walking, they crested a low hill. The trees thinned, and below them, stretching out like a silver ribbon under the afternoon sun, was a great river. It was the Rhine. On the far bank, stark and beautiful, stood a Roman watchtower, its red-tiled roof a beacon of civilization. From its peak, catching the wind, flew the unmistakable golden eagle of a legion standard. They stopped, a collective, ragged breath escaping their lips. Marcus sank to his knees and wept openly, the terror of the past weeks finally washing out of him. Gaius stood rigid, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek as he stared at the flag. He had completed his mission. Cassius looked at his 4 companions, his brothers, and felt the full, crushing weight of their survival. They were the last piece of the 17th. They did not cheer or shout. Their ordeal had burned away such grand displays. Instead, they simply began to walk down the final slope toward the river bank, their pace steady. They were no longer ghosts fleeing a nightmare. They were witnesses, marching to deliver their legion's last solemn report.